Chapter 15, Alexander 12, June 2nd, 45,796 BC. None had ever heard the name of Alexander. The Tuolans loved Hemhut, and his Lyalan loved him most of all. Hemhut had saved Tuwala. He had made right the skies, which then no longer shined with electric light when it ought to be night. He settled threatening storms before ever they blew their first wind, and he rid the starlight of its vicious, cancerous rays. Those Tuolans that came to him were healed of what ailed them, and the sparse population began to gravitate toward their savior. In the 5 years since Lyalan drew him from stone, 14 for every 15 Tuolans had relocated to the northern continent, Pafa-Adoa, to be nearer the savior of Tuwala. Almost all of them now lived in the central city that he and Lyalan called home. Hemhut could not say how it was that he did the things that he did, only that he simply knew that he could do them and, therefore not limited by any self-imposed doubt, simply did them. The thought that he might not be able to fix the skies over Tuwala never occurred to him, so he fixed them. The thought that he might not be able to cool her warming waters never crossed his mind, so he made them cool. He willed it, with no doubt that it would be so, and so it was. The past 5 years had been wonderful. Hemhut, with little Lyalan by his side, brought peace and prosperity to all of Tuwala, and he learned every day from Lyalan. He learned that she could balance on one foot for minutes on end. He learned that her favorite colors were pink, red, and blue, but that she also liked purple, green, orange, and yellow. He learned that she would sometimes snort when she laughed hard, which he found highly endearing, and that she was a little embarrassed about it. But most of all, he learned what it meant to love and to be loved. She was the happiest being to have ever existed in all of time, always pleasant and cheerful and helpful and hopeful and loving. She meant everything to Hemhut, and he meant everything to her. They cherished every moment they spent together. She aimed her love at the problems of the world, and he addressed them, and all was right with the world, until it wasn't. Hemhut had long been all of Tuwala, and he could see the present through the eyes of all that lived there, and knew every intimate moment of their lives, all of their past and those of their ancestors, and he would right the wrongs of Tuolans gone astray, go to them, and lead them away from strife to happiness. He also sought to protect the whole of the population, and that is where he began to fail. On Pafa-Adoa, where the population had condensed, things were still very good, but things were starting to go awry once more for those left behind on 2 of the other 3 habitable continents, the 2 on the other side of Tuwala from Pafa-Adoa. That part of the world seemed to be rapidly descending into chaos as temperatures began to plummet, and the night sky once more became awash with the arcing lights that Hemhut had made vanish those 5 years gone by. He couldn't control it. He couldn't contain it without also sacrificing Pafa-Adoa and Nefa-Adoa. Even once the freeze had claimed its victory, and one whole face of Tuwala turned ghostly pale, completely covered in ice, it continued to spread. Hemhut was desperate to understand what was happening, but no Tuwalan knew anything that could help him. Then he decided that he must keep the remaining Tuwalan safe, and devised a plan to do just that. He would divine a machine capable of rendering and repairing matter on an atomic scale, one that could indefinitely store the Tuwalan population in a deconstructed state as he devises the means to rescue their home. He willed it, and so it was that the amalgamator came to be. It could be any shape, and could change to accommodate any need. It had been built from the dirt of Tuwala, formed by Hemhut's will, and it was nearly finished. All that he needed then to do to complete it was share with it his mind, so that it could do that which he had designed it capable of, so that it would be imbued with the knowledge of Hemhut, and thereby that of all Tuwala. It was a metal sphere, so perfectly reflective that it would seem invisible in places of monotone color. It was about 2 feet in diameter and flawlessly smooth. The shining metallic ball that would soon forever after be the amalgamator hovered in front of Hemhut as he stood ready to activate it in the town square, and he bid Lyalan retreat to safety just in case of some unforeseen consequence. The little mousy Tuwalan didn't go very far. She backed away from him, clutching her hands together in front of her with concern, having only now ever been told by Hemhut to leave his side for even a moment, and only now an inkling aware of the concept of the possible dangers associated with what he was trying to achieve. She only halved the distance between him and the crowd of Tuwalans watching from behind makeshift walls from the intersecting streets, and said to him, "Be careful, Hemhut. Don't get hurt." "Fear not for me, Lyalan," he said. "It is true, I am awakening a great being, But I am myself of great fortitude. There is nothing wrong with the design of the machine. Everything should be fine. But for the sake of the chance that something should go wrong, I want you to know, I love you, Lylin. It was the first time he'd ever said it aloud, and deep worry then set into her mind. She would be lost without him, as lost as he would be without her, and the notion that he might be about to sacrifice himself to save them all and right in front of her made her blood run cold. She ran back up to him and shouted in their Tuwalan language, "No, Hemhut, stop!" But she was too late. Hemhut touched his fingers to the ball and closed his eyes. The sphere began to change shape and came to take on the form of a man, a form similar to that of Hemhut. Then the metal figure transposed and brought arms from out of its sides and moved its hands up to touch Hemhut's temples. Hemhut gasped, eyes still closed, and began to grimace and wince and squeeze his eyes shut, and the near-featureless humanoid metal structure that had grown from the sphere began to swell and grow taller, pulsing like a heartbeat all the while, and Hemhut anguished as it probed deeper into his mind and continued to grow until it towered over him, making its bent form seem all the more menacing. Lylin was so afraid for him, but she didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to help him. She took a cautious step toward him, then another, and reached her hand out to touch him. But just before her fingertips would have landed, he fell. The staggeringly tall metallic form had released him, and he had fallen unconscious to the floor. It was just moments until the scattered streams of colorful light that they'd learned to fear began to creep along the skyline and again electrify the sky, and a cold breeze set in that began to immediately intensify. The amalgamator stood there, their savior at his feet, and the unsure Tuwalans stared at it, hardly a one of them daring to move. Lylin fell to the ground in a panic and placed Hemhut's head in her lap, crying his name and cursing the machine that had taken him from her, presuming him dead. "Listen to me! I am not going anywhere!" She angrily stood and pointed a finger at the amalgamator's face 3 stories up. "You are not taking me away from him. I don't care if I die, okay? If he is dead, I do not want to live. You don't take me." She lay down on the floor and curled up next to her love, staring into his face through the tears that streamed from her eyes. "You don't take me. I stay with him. I die with him. No, Hemhut." And she let go a wailing cry wrought of so much heartache, it made the observing Tuwalans uncertain as to whether the cold they were feeling was real or in response to the sound of her complete sadness. Then the wind began getting stronger. A strange and foreboding deep howl was heard in the distance all around, quiet at first, but quickly growing to a deafening roar. It didn't sound like any natural wind. It sounded more like the ground being torn apart in the distance around them. Within 1 minute of Hemhut having collapsed, the skies of old had returned, the winds had grown from a breeze to that of a raging storm, and an ungodly cold had sunk in on them. The amalgamator did nothing. It simply stood there, doing nothing but being, simply processing. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. It was not dissecting the Tuwalans and storing their atoms as they were told to expect. It did nothing as death set in on Tuwala. If no one were to have intervened, they would have all been dead within minutes, evident by the unnaturally rapid onset of the changes to the air and sky and the rapidly dropping temperatures. As Lylin began to shake uncontrollably from the cold, curled up next to him, thinking that perhaps it had all gone wrong and she would not be the only Tuwalan to die that day, that perhaps this was the last hour of the Tuwalan people, just as she was ready to abandon hope, her love roused and opened his eyes. He set straight away righting the world again, and it warmed again, and the wind stopped, and she was safe again. He scooped up Lylin and warmed himself so that she could be warm, and she looked up at him, still shivering in his arms, and said, "I love you, Hemhut, so much, and I don't want to go. I've decided that I want to stay here with you. I don't want to be alone without you." "But you will not even notice the passage of time," Hemhut told her. "When you next see me, it will feel like mere moments have passed, no matter how long it takes for me to right Tuwala from this state of disrepair." "No," she said. "What if something goes wrong? I'll never see you again. I'm staying with you. Besides, I don't think your machine works. It didn't do anything." "No," he said, and he shifted his forearm so that she could better see. Everyone else was gone. All of the Tuwalans that had been watching Hemhut activate his machine, all Tuwalans everywhere, had disappeared. The amalgamator still stood in the same place, seeming not to have moved at all, seeming to have done nothing at all, but now carrying the future of Tawala, all of the Tawalan people in its limitless stores. What? She looked around in amazement, mouth agape, as she motioned to be set down. They're all inside of it now? Yes, said Hemhut, safe for another day. Please don't send me away, Hemhut. I love you. I want to stay with you. She clasped her hands in pleading. Before I sent them away, I would have said that it was not safe for you to stay here. But with them gone, Tawala has become much easier to control. It seems I can sustain you indefinitely. It seems that there is plenty to spare where there was scarcity moments ago. I love you, Lylin, and I am overjoyed that you would want to spend the rest of your life here, just the two of us. But having your company to look forward to in the future is what makes saving Tawala worthwhile for me. Saving it only to live in it without you is unthinkable, he said. Listen to me, silly, she said, climbing up to her perch on his shoulder and grabbing him by the cheeks, tossing glances at the motionless amalgamator here and there. You are going to live forever, and I am only going to live as long as I live. There is only one future in which we are together indefinitely, and that is one in the afterlife. No matter how long you delay it, I will die. I would rather have you all to myself for the rest of my life than have to share you with the rest of Tawala as I have had to all these years. Don't send me away, my love. Let me die here, alone with you. He gave it a moment's consideration, and then he said, Very well, my love. The amalgamator stood, the 15-foot tower of silver dwarfing the gray giant, motionless, facing the couple. Hemhut turned to face it, and looked up at the sheen of silver oval that comprised its likeness of a head. Ahoa, Metet, Hemhut said with a smile, which meant greetings, friend, in Lylan's Tawalan dialect. Hello, master, the amalgamator said, in English. Hemhut didn't understand how it was that he understood, but he knew exactly what it was his machine had said. It had said, Hello, master, and though Hemhut had no recollection of ever knowing English, he knew it all the same. He was puzzled for the first time in a long time, and stepped up to place himself in front of Lylan, shielding his love from his machine, unsure of any potential danger, and he looked it up and down. If it came to a fight, he would not be at odds with destroying the amalgamator. Though it carried the future of all that is Tawala, he would destroy it in an instant before allowing it to harm Lylan, and Hemhut mentally prepared to dismantle it. Then it spoke again. Your plan will not work. Tawala cannot be saved, master, it said again in English. Hemhut approached it, holding a palm out behind him to indicate to Lylan that she needed to keep her distance. Then intuitively, and much to Lylan's surprise, Hemhut spoke to the amalgamator in English. As he came closer to it, he said, Show me. Then the great mass of shiny metal bent and once again placed its divine fingers against Hemhut's temples. He did not lose consciousness this time, and it took only a moment for Hemhut to receive and process the information the amalgamator shared with him. Then he remembered who he was, what he'd done, and he saw what he was going to do. The future unfolded before his very eyes as his full intellectual capacity was unleashed. He turned to Lylan, and he said, as the realization of what had happened to their doomed world came to light in his mind, in his native English, Oh God. He looked up at the second sun, now realizing what it was, where they were, and why their world was falling to pieces, and he accepted that he would have to give up on Tawala. Lylan approached and took his hand in hers and asked what was wrong. Hemhut looked at Lylan, seeing both himself through her eyes and her through his, and smiled. Lylan 12.12, March 28, 2311 AD. Rosa Carter tore down the road. The highway had started out winding, but it had leveled off into a straightaway, and she put the pedal to the metal. The high-powered sports car she was driving maxed out at 240, and she was approaching 200 miles per hour. The train could be seen traveling parallel to her about 500 feet away and quickly narrowing the gap between them. All she had to do was make it to the crossroads before the speeding train. She only had to make it another 10 seconds. She glanced at the train, hardly even moving her head, but it was enough of a distraction that she almost lost control when she looked back and saw taillights in front of her. A car had pulled onto the highway from off the side of the road directly in front of her. She turned the wheel so quickly to avoid the car that she actually went up on two wheels for a moment, but she managed to maintain control and swerve around it just in time, and had only lost a little momentum for having done so. It looked like she was going to do it. The train driver blew the horn at her. It looked like she was going to just barely beat the train, but just as she was 40 feet from the railroad crossing, flying in excess of 230 miles per hour, her front passenger side tire blew out, and she and her car began rapidly hurtling end over end. Rosa felt like the whole thing was happening in slow motion. Her pupils dilated, and her heart pounded in her chest. She held her breath as the car flew through the air and then smashed into the engine car of the high-speed train, bursting into flames and shooting wreckage in every direction. Then the simulation was over. The museum staff removed the cap and the electrodes, and Rosa stood up from her seat, a little disoriented at first. Then she went to Emma with a huge smile and said, "That was so much fun. Were you watching? I was so close." "Yeah, I saw," Emma said, smiling back at her enthusiastic friend. "You did get close, but no one ever makes it past the train. That's the whole point of the whole thing. No one ever survives." This was by far the most popular display at the Daniel Dwyer Museum. It was the exhibit showcasing how people of times past used to drive their own vehicles, putting everyone's lives in danger every day, and how Daniel Dwyer put an end both to the threat imposed by human error in driving, flying, and boating, and to the use of fossil fuels to power vehicles. In the beginning, in the year 2059, he eliminated the potential for human error by decreeing that he and only he would from then on drive and pilot craft in place of man. This was met with much disdain. People loved their vehicles. When he took on the energy problem, there was initially an outcry from the public to adapt solar power and other natural sustainable resources, and since he considered many of these methods adequate for powering less dangerous machinery and electronics, he temporarily allowed for the farming of such resources to meet their needs. But by the year 2065, all vehicles were powered by Daniel himself, and by the 24th century, all electricity was man-made, reliant no more on factors beyond his control. For he could not force the sun to shine to produce solar energy in the dark, or make the wind blow to power turbines in the calm. But he could simultaneously generate power and ensure the physical fitness of his people by instating mandatory regular exercise periods and storing electricity created by the transfer of kinetic energy from the motion as people use the exercise equipment. In the 24th century, every individual has their own pods which are carried through the air by Daniel and use none of the Earth's natural resources whatsoever. They make no sound as they pass, and they can travel at incredibly fast speeds, potentially capable of traveling as fast as Daniel Dwyer was capable of moving. But, given the overly cautious, doting ruler he was, he never tested the pod's strain limit, and he never went faster than 200 miles per hour, his own self-imposed speed limit. No one on Earth had commandeered a vehicle in 250 years. That was one of the chief reasons that the driving experience at the museum was so popular. Though the same driving format was popular with gamers of the time, video games having become the fully immersive experience that they'd become, it allowed for museum patrons who weren't also video game fans to sample what it would have actually been like to drive, and then also to die as a result. On any given day, museum goers would have to wait in line for a good half an hour or more to enjoy the driving experience because of the long line typically trailing away from it. Rosa was still reeling from the experience. It just felt so real. Like I could feel my hair blowing in the wind and the force of acceleration against my body. It was exhilarating, she said. "Oh, Emma, I wish you could try it yourself." Emma shrugged and said, "Now don't you go pitying me. I've done it thousands of times, just not as myself." Rosa was visibly shaking as her heart continued to pound in her chest and said, "Wow, but you saw it though. That was amazing." "Yes, it always is," Emma said. The entire exhibit was interactive. There were 6 control stations where patrons could cycle through holographic representations of all types of vehicles from throughout history and learn about each and every one of them. The history would always include information on the dangers of piloting or traveling in the selected vehicles and highlight the inadequate safety measures and other unacceptable flaws respective of their type. In a very real sense, though only conveyed through subliminal undertones, the museum display portrayed every single vehicle ever conceived of by mankind to be an instrument of death, plain and simple. This underlying theme only became apparent when cycling through information about various vehicle types, due to the fact that the common denominator in all of the descriptions was how dangerous they were and how often they'd formerly endangered people and claimed lives, all but one of them ending with stills of one or more mangled, if not charred, corpses. Of course, there was one vehicle that was depicted as being safe as one's own bed, delicate as a baby's tears, having never been named responsible for any injury or death ever in its long history in operation, and that was the Dwyer pod. Every person on Earth had their very own Dwyer pod. Daniel encouraged them to be creative and personalize their pods, not only so that they would stand out from the others, but so that it would feel like the pods really and truly belonged to them. He would typically fly them anywhere between 3,000 and 4,000 feet up, seamlessly interacting with one another to negate any need for deceleration until just before approaching their destinations. They used no fuel. They worked literally by way of Daniel carrying them through the sky. Subsidizing and gradually eliminating the automotive industry had been easy. Daniel, having needed labor and materials to construct the Dwyer pods, faded the jobs out slowly, mostly through retirement rather than layoffs, before eventually assuming complete control over the construction operation. The fossil fuel industry, however, was another monster altogether. In the end, after days and days of attempts at negotiation and compromise on the part of the greedy corporations, Daniel finally lost his patience and put the hammer down. The doors would, from then on, remain locked. All interests with stakes in sources of pollutants would soon find themselves living beyond their means. The fact that many of those who profited most only had to sell off a few of their vacation homes to thereafter remain financially secure was a testament to the breadth of their greed. They had benefited so much by pillaging and polluting the earth and by overpricing their products that even with no further source of income, they were still set for life. The arrival of Daniel Dwyer, marked by his famous message to mankind, was the start of an unprecedented upheaval of society. The people of the time tried everything at their disposal to combat the demon, but he was truly an unstoppable force. They were helpless against his power, and literally could not fight him or usurp his place as the self-declared ruler of the world. Many also openly supported Daniel at the time of his uprising, particularly members of the Society of the Spirit, which was later reformed into the First Church of Daniel Dwyer, much to his quieted objections and supposed discontent. Support for him only grew as he made it evident that any retaliation effort against his supporters would be thwarted, and one need not fear so much as a sharp tongue from their not-so-like-minded brothers and sisters. As many extremists attempted to attack the early Dwyerists and were met with only the peaceful dismantling of the fruits of their labor. In the 24th century, Daniel Dwyer was simply a part of life. He was your mother and father, your doctor and your chauffeur. There was no such thing as a homeless person or a poor person or a hungry person. Everyone was treated equally, rewarded for good behavior, and prevented from behaving badly. The women considered it an honor to be selected for pregnancy, especially if they were selected more than once, and the men gladly donated sperm if asked. There were veritably no genetic disorders or diseases anymore, and all of his children were healthy and beautiful. The fact that Emma had been born blind was cause for celebration at the time of her birth, as no child had been born blind in over 200 years until she'd come along. This was something Daniel would also do. When, by the cause of some unforeseen randomized gene sequencing combination, a mistake was born, he would celebrate them throughout their life along with the refrain of all society. So, instead of being stared at or misunderstood throughout their lives, anyone born different would be regarded as special, perhaps even seen as favored by the Spirit. Super Jack King, born in the year 2257, had been the only person to have been born with Down syndrome since the inception of Daniel's rule, and he was about the luckiest person to have ever lived. Daniel spent a great deal of effort making him happy and seemed to love him with great warmth, perhaps because Super Jack King had been so simple-minded and innocent and had given nothing but love right back to Daniel, with never a hint of malice in his heart. Most of his people would go through a rebellious phase and openly defy Daniel at some point in their lives, usually during their adolescence. But Super Jack King was Daniel's friend from beginning to end, through and through. The world cried when he died, and Daniel Dwyer lamented his passing greatly. There was even a Super Jack King memorial exhibit in Delaware, where he'd hailed from. Daniel perpetually depreciated currency, year after year on a global scale, with the eventual aim being to wean his people completely off of the use of money altogether by the year 2400. The average salary for a working citizen was $10,000 at the turn of the 24th century, and necessities were free for all. The cost of superfluous things was reduced in concert with the reduced value of currency, and it all seemed to be working well for the time. He certainly was not looking forward to having to make the final transition to a moneyless society with all of the nuances and complexities that would need to be addressed, but it would be worth it in the end. Emma and Rosa had grown up together in the Carter house with two boys, David and Uther, all of whom bore the name of their house. For last names were no longer indicative of one's lineage, but rather were the name of one's household. When asked in the beginning how the people should go about preventing incestuous relationships from accidentally occurring, considering their inability to recognize family, Daniel told them that since they could no longer produce viable children as a result of mating, anyone was free to engage in sexual congress with anyone else, provided it be consensual and not unlawful, regardless of lineage. Mothers and sons, fathers and daughters, brothers and sisters, it made no difference to him. When the people responded with outrage, he pointed out that every human was already so closely related to every other human that incest was already unavoidable, and that a large focus of his breeding program was engineered around diversifying the gene pool to a greater degree than they would left to their own devices. He was quick to point out that more than 10% of the world population during the 21st century descended directly from one man, Genghis Khan. The Carter boys had gone on to do their own thing, and they didn't hear much from them anymore, but Emma and Rosa had stayed close friends. When Emma came into her powers at the age of 12, Daniel immediately recognized and celebrated her abilities and helped her through the trying time she'd had adjusting. Many people until recently remained skeptical of Emma's powers, surprising considering they lived in a world of ghost-powered vehicles and were subject to having their bodies commandeered without their knowledge or consent by the same entity that powered their pods. It wasn't until her prediction of the volcanic eruption which had erupted 6 days ago that the majority of the world really started to take notice of her. Daniel always knew that she was special, and that she would come into her own one day. He loved Emma Carter, and Emma Carter loved him. Neither of them was aware that they were so leisurely walking hand in hand into the jaws of death, that Daniel had invited and welcomed the potential instrument of his own demise into his company. But all the same, in less than an hour, Emma Carter would be no more, and the demon Daniel Dwyer and indeed the world would learn to tremble at the sound of her true name, and she would finally have her revenge. Emma and Rosa Carter were not biological sisters, Emma clearly a mixed-race child with a dark enough complexion to deduce that either her mother or father must have been of African descent, and Rosa lily-white with jet-black hair, likely of Hispanic descent, but they were sisters all the same. They had been inseparable growing up, and had never lost touch. Even for the few years that they did not live together, they'd stayed in constant contact, and Emma would watch her and watch the world around her, advising her as she always had. She would tell her when her boyfriends were lying to her or cheating on her, and she would warn her of her coming missteps as she had throughout their teen years together. When Daniel had diagnosed Emma with an unknown heart condition, he consented to the two of them living together again, as Rosa had been trained in nursing and could intervene with basic life support should Emma ever be in need. More of a gesture on his part than anything to be taken seriously. For Daniel himself would likely intervene well before Rosa would ever have an opportunity if Emma were ever to be in crisis. He wasn't known for leaving things to chance. Rosa was more than happy to comply, and they'd lived happily together ever since. Rosa was still ecstatic from the driving experience, and thought that so far this had been the best day yet of her blessed life. She looked at Emma, and Emma looked right back at her, seeing only herself. She was so happy to be there with her. By the hour's end, she would not recognize the person behind her sister's empty gaze, but there is at least some small consolation for her in knowing that she would not mourn the loss of her sister for very long. Before moving on with the tour, Rosa asked if she could try the driving experience once more, and she smiled at Emma as the staff reattached the electrodes to her neck and forehead and placed the brain interface cap back on her head. Emma gave her a thumbs up and told her to keep her eyes on the road this time. No advice was fruitful when it came to the driving experience at the museum. There was no getting past the train. Each and every simulation ended in death, with no exceptions.